10,000 research and manufacturing jobs could land in Canada if Ottawa adds the Swedish fighter jet to its military fleet.
We, as Saab, we are prepared to do that technology transfer to Canada and support that bill.
Good evening. One of the largest defense contractors in Europe is making a play for a piece of this country's military market.
Ottawa, late 2025, in a move that Canadian officials insist is technical, but which Washington privately recognizes as strategic defiance, the government of Canada has formally reopened the assumptions underpinning its F-35 fighter jet acquisition. The decision, announced as a routine life cycle and industrial review, lands with the force of a declaration. Canada is no longer prepared to anchor its national security, industrial base, and long-term sovereignty to American predictability that no longer exists. This is not a dispute about aircraft performance. It is a rupture over power, leverage, and trust. For decades, the logic governing U.S.-Canada defense relations was simple and unspoken. Canada bought American systems. The United States, in return, guaranteed access, stability, and political goodwill. That logic depended on one fragile condition: predictability. By late 2025, Ottawa has concluded that this condition has collapsed. The reopening of the F-35 file is Canada's first overt act of strategic pushback in what is rapidly becoming an irreconcilable divergence between the two countries' economic and political trajectories. Officially, Canada's review of the F-35 is framed around cost control, industrial participation, and supply chain resilience. Unofficially, it is a response to a pattern of American behavior that Ottawa now regards as coercive, arbitrary, and structurally hostile. Since 2024, the United States has repeatedly invoked national security rationales to impose or threaten punitive tariffs on Canadian exports, steel, aluminum, automotive components, and critical minerals, despite Canada being Washington's most deeply integrated ally. In 2025, those measures escalated sharply, with new tariffs imposed through emergency authorities, bypassing traditional dispute mechanisms and diplomatic consultation. From Ottawa's perspective, the message was unmistakable. Alliance status no longer shields Canada from economic weaponization. Dependence, once the price of stability, had become a liability. It is within this context that the F-35 transformed from a defense procurement program into a strategic vulnerability. The F-35 is not merely a fighter jet. It is a closed ecosystem. Software updates, mission data files, maintenance protocols, and operational upgrades are all controlled through U.S. systems and approvals. Participation implies decades-long dependence, not just militarily, but politically. Under conditions of mutual trust, that dependence was tolerable. Under conditions of tariff shocks, policy reversals, and unilateral pressure, it became untenable. Canadian defense planners quietly began asking a question that would once have been unthinkable. What happens if access to upgrades, parts, or support becomes a bargaining chip in an unrelated trade dispute? No such threat has been made explicitly. None needs to be. The mere plausibility of political interference is enough to change the risk calculus of a 40-year weapon system. Washington's irritation at Canada's reconsideration of the F-35 is rooted less in the contract itself than in what the review exposes. For generations, U.S. policymakers operated on a core assumption. Canada's strategic alignment was automatic. Procurement loyalty was treated as a constant, not a variable. That assumption allowed the United States to treat Canada simultaneously as a partner in security and a pressure point in trade, confident that Ottawa had nowhere else to go. The F-35 review signals that this era is over. By entertaining alternatives, most notably European platforms offering domestic production, technology transfer, and life cycle sovereignty, Canada is demonstrating that it is willing to absorb friction today to reduce exposure tomorrow. This is not hedging. It is disengagement from a hierarchy. Canada no longer accepts. The deeper conflict exposed by the F-35 dispute is structural. The United States increasingly governs its external relationships through the lens of industrial nationalism and transactional leverage. Canada, by contrast, remains economically dependent on open, rules-based systems that the U.S. itself is now undermining. In this environment, the alliance becomes asymmetric. Washington can apply pressure without meaningful retaliation. Ottawa absorbs costs without reciprocal influence. The F-35 crystallizes this imbalance. To proceed unquestioningly with the purchase would be to lock Canada's defense posture into a system controlled by a partner that has demonstrated its willingness to weaponize interdependence. Ottawa's response is not dramatic. There are no speeches, no denunciations. There is only process reviews, assessments, consultations. But the intent is unmistakable. Canada is preparing for a future in which American preferences are no longer treated as immutable constraints. What makes this moment consequential is not the likelihood that Canada ultimately cancels the F-35, though that possibility now exists. It is the precedent that has been set. Once a country as integrated, as exposed, and as cautious as Canada publicly reopens the question of American defense primacy, the psychological barrier is broken. Strategic dependence is no longer destiny. The United States may yet salvage the contract. What it cannot easily restore is the assumption that Canada's loyalty can be taken for granted while its economy is subjected to unilateral pressure. The F-35 dispute is not a policy disagreement. It is the first visible crack in a relationship built on habits that no longer survive contact with modern power politics. What finally pushed Ottawa from quiet unease to strategic recalibration was not a single tariff or threat, but a pattern. Over the past 2 years, U.S. economic policy toward Canada has shifted from rules-based management to episodic coercion applied suddenly, justified broadly, and withdrawn selectively. For a country whose prosperity depends on predictability, the implications were profound. From Canada's vantage point, the escalation of American trade measures in 2024-2025 marked a turning point. Tariffs imposed under emergency authorities, often framed around national security or domestic industrial protection, cut across sectors that form the backbone of Canada's export economy: steel, aluminum, automotive components, and energy inputs. These measures were introduced with limited consultation and little regard for North American integration, despite Canada's deep compliance with shared standards and agreements. The result was not simply higher costs, it was a collapse in trust. Canadian officials began to recognize that the United States was no longer differentiating between rivals and allies in its application of economic force. The logic was transactional: pressure first, negotiation later. Exemptions became favors, not rights. Compliance was assumed, not earned. In this environment, economic interdependence stopped functioning as a stabilizer. It became leverage held overwhelmingly by Washington. For decades, Canada accepted this asymmetry on the assumption that it would never be exploited against a close ally. That assumption no longer holds. When tariffs can be imposed or adjusted by executive discretion, long-term investment decisions become hostage to political cycles south of the border. Capital delays follow, supply chains hesitate, insurance costs rise. These are not abstract effects, they are balance sheet realities. The defense sector, once insulated from such volatility, could not remain untouched. Ottawa understood that a 30-40-year weapons platform is in effect a bet on the political behavior of its supplier. Under current conditions, that bet looked increasingly reckless. What angered Canadian policymakers most was not the economic pain itself, but the absence of reciprocity. When the United States invoked security to justify trade restrictions, Canada did not respond in kind. Instead, Ottawa rolled back most retaliatory measures, signaling restraint and a desire to de-escalate. Yet pressure continued in other forms. The lesson Ottawa drew was blunt. Restraint was no longer read as partnership. It was read as weakness. This realization reshaped Canada's approach. Rather than contest each tariff episode, Ottawa began to focus on reducing exposure altogether. The objective shifted from winning disputes to redesigning dependencies. Defense procurement, previously treated as sacrosanct, was pulled into this logic. The F-35 became a symbol not because of what it is, but because of what it represents: a decades-long commitment to a supplier whose economic policy Canada can neither influence nor reliably predict. In a world where trade has been securitized and alliances monetized, that level of dependence is strategically indefensible. Canada's response is not retaliation, it is re-architecture. By reassessing the F-35, Ottawa is signaling that economic coercion carries consequences beyond trade balances. It affects trust, alignment, and the very structure of alliances. The message to Washington is implicit but clear. Pressure applied indiscriminately eventually forces partners to seek insulation. This is why the rift now appears irreconcilable. The United States views economic leverage as a legitimate instrument of statecraft. Canada views the same behavior as a breach of the assumptions that made deep integration viable. Those positions cannot easily be reconciled. What distinguishes Canada's current turn from earlier moments of friction with the United States is not tone, but architecture. Ottawa is no longer attempting to negotiate relief within an existing framework of dependence. It is attempting to redesign that framework altogether. At the center of this effort lies a concept that has quietly re-entered Canadian strategic thinking after decades of dormancy: industrial sovereignty. For much of the post-Cold War period, Canada accepted a subordinate position within the North American industrial hierarchy. High-value design, systems integration, and platform control resided overwhelmingly in the United States. Canada supplied components, labor, and market access. The arrangement was efficient but asymmetric. It worked as long as the system remained stable. The F-35 dispute exposes why Ottawa now considers that hierarchy obsolete and dangerous. Canada's defense establishment understands that modern weapon systems are no longer discrete assets. They are networked platforms embedded in software ecosystems governed by intellectual property, export controls, and political discretion. Ownership without control is not sovereignty, it is custodianship. The F-35 epitomizes this reality. Even participating partners do not possess autonomous control over mission data, upgrade schedules, or system modifications. Operational effectiveness is contingent on continuous access to U.S.-managed infrastructure. In an era when Washington has demonstrated a willingness to blur the line between security and commerce, that dependency takes on a different meaning. The question Ottawa is now asking is no longer whether the F-35 is the most advanced aircraft available, but whether any aircraft that embeds permanent political dependence is compatible with Canadian strategic autonomy. This shift marks a fundamental break from past procurement logic. Much of the public discussion around Canada's engagement with European defense suppliers has focused on comparisons of capability. This misses the point. The appeal of non-U.S. platforms lies not in marginal performance trade-offs, but in governance models. European offers emphasize domestic assembly, technology transfer, and local upgrade authority not as concessions, but as baseline conditions. For Canada, this represents something far more consequential than job creation. It represents a pathway out of life cycle subordination. By insisting on domestic production, Ottawa is not merely seeking economic offsets. It is seeking to anchor strategic capabilities within national institutions, universities, and firms' capabilities that persist regardless of shifts in U.S. electoral politics or trade doctrine. This is how industrial sovereignty is built, not through autarky, but through control over critical layers of value creation. Canada's recalibration is also geographic. As trust in North American predictability erodes, Ottawa has begun to deepen engagement with the broader transatlantic bloc, not as an ideological statement, but as a risk management strategy. European defense and industrial frameworks offer something the United States currently does not: policy continuity across electoral cycles. Regulatory regimes move slowly. Industrial partnerships are governed by multilateral rules rather than executive discretion. For a middle power, this matters. By diversifying defense and industrial partnerships across the Atlantic, Canada reduces the probability that a single political decision in Washington can disrupt decades of planning. It also signals to domestic stakeholders, workers, investors, provinces, that national resilience will no longer be hostage to foreign volatility. This is not abandonment of the United States, it is decentering. From Washington's perspective, the danger is not losing a fighter jet contract. It is losing hierarchical centrality. The post-war North American order rested on an implicit bargain: access to the American system in exchange for alignment. Canada's move challenges the premise that alignment requires submission to a single industrial and technological core. If Canada succeeds in building a defense posture that is interoperable but not dependent, integrated but not captive, the model becomes exportable. Other allies will ask the same questions Ottawa is now asking. Other procurement systems will be redesigned around sovereignty rather than loyalty. This is why the rift exposed by the F-35 cannot be easily repaired. It is not about persuasion. It is about structure. Canada's industrial turn is a response to a new strategic environment in which dependence no longer guarantees protection and loyalty no longer ensures restraint. Under such conditions, maintaining the old hierarchy would require an act of faith Ottawa is no longer willing to perform. What is emerging instead is a doctrine of controlled autonomy. Remain allied, remain interoperable, but never again be structurally exposed. That doctrine is incompatible with the assumptions that once governed U.S.-Canada relations, and that is why the F-35 debate marks more than a procurement dispute. It marks Canada's deliberate exit from a system that no longer rewards trust. If the F-35 dispute has revealed anything with clarity, it is not Canada's ambition to confront the United States, but Washington's growing inability to interpret restraint as strategy. What Ottawa has done quietly, procedurally, and without spectacle is often misunderstood in American discourse as hesitation. In reality, it is commitment. Commitment to a different equilibrium. The danger for the United States lies precisely here. For decades, American policymakers and investors have operated under an assumption so ingrained that it rarely required articulation. North America is structurally stable by default. Canada would absorb shocks. Canada would adapt. Canada would remain aligned because alignment was rational, inevitable, and cost-effective. That assumption is now obsolete. Canada's response to U.S. pressure has not been emotional nor ideological. It has been architectural. Ottawa is redesigning exposure layer by layer across defense, procurement, industrial policy, and alliance geometry. The F-35 review is merely the most visible seam in a much broader reconfiguration. What makes this moment especially consequential is that the shift is asymmetric in awareness. Canada understands the implications of divergence. The United States largely does not. From Washington's vantage point, nothing dramatic has occurred. There has been no rupture treaty, no retaliatory escalation, no open defiance. Yet this is precisely how structural power erodes, not through confrontation, but through normalization of alternatives. For American policymakers, the warning embedded in Canada's behavior is stark. Leverage that must be exercised to be felt is already decaying. When allies begin to plan around U.S. unpredictability rather than trust against it, the costs of coercion compound invisibly over time. For investors, the implications are no less serious. North American integration, long treated as a low-risk constant, is becoming a variable. Defense supply chains, automotive production, critical minerals, and energy infrastructure are all being repriced against political volatility. Capital is already responding, not to headlines, but to signals embedded in procurement reviews, regulatory language, and long-term contracts. This is how confidence drains from systems before data catches up. The most profound consequence of the F-35 episode, however, lies in precedent. Canada is not the largest U.S. ally. It is not the most assertive. It is, by design and temperament, cautious. When such a country decides that dependence is no longer tolerable, others take note. The lesson traveling quietly through allied capitals is not that the United States is hostile, but that alignment without insulation is no longer prudent. Once that lesson is absorbed, reversing it becomes exceedingly difficult. For the United States, this is not a call to retreat from leadership. It is a call to redefine it. Leadership grounded in pressure rather than predictability invites hedging. Leadership that treats interdependence as a weapon ultimately incentivizes disconnection. Canada's recalibration exposes a choice Washington has long postponed. Maintain influence through stability and reciprocity, or accelerate fragmentation by insisting on hierarchy in a world that no longer tolerates it. The F-35 will eventually be decided. Aircraft always are. What will not be easily reversed is the mental shift that accompanied its reassessment. The era in which Canada's alignment could be assumed rather than earned is ending. Not with a rupture, but with a recalibration so methodical that it risks being overlooked until its effects are irreversible. And that is the final warning embedded in this story. When the quietest ally begins to redesign its dependencies, the issue is no longer procurement, nor even policy. It is whether the system that once held North America together still produces trust or merely demands compliance. The answer to that question will determine far more than the fate of a fighter jet. It will determine whether the old equilibrium survives in anything more than memory.